Hello and welcome to Chain Reaction, a new podcast series examining America's role in the world. I am your host, Aaron Stein, Director of Research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. Every 2 weeks, we'll talk to experts about a variety of topics and why it matters for U.S. foreign policy. Today, we are joined by Becca Wasser, a fellow in the Defense Program at the Center for New American Security. On this episode, we discuss the recently announced Global Posture Review and the potential implications for the U.S. military and America's global alliances. Enjoy the discussion. Hello and welcome. Today I'm talking to Becca Wasser, fellow in the Defense Program and the co-lead of the Gaming Lab at the Center for New American Security in Washington, D.C. Becca, it's good to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
We were just talking offline about how nice the CNAS off. Is it CNAS or CNAS? I never know what to call it.
Oh, it's CNAS. There's
CNAS.
no CNAS about.
There's no CNAS. Okay, it's CNAS. I was talking about how nice it is, how nice your offices are, but you guys probably haven't been there in a very long time.
No, there are a lot of plants that need to get watered.
I think we all share that in that the coronavirus pandemic has altered our work life. But with that, there are new officials hard at work in the Biden administration, and one of which is Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who has been very busy, I should say, in the 2 weeks or so he's been in office. And I think just last night there was the announcement about a global posture review for the U.S. military. I thought that would be a good excuse to bring you on the show. So, what do you make of the announcement last night about the posture review?
Well, I think that it's pretty timely, and it's something that's definitely much needed. You know, this won't be the first global posture review. There's been many, but I do think that it's setting the tone that there's going to be a very different approach to how posture choices are being made, but also how some of the force and resource allocations that are part of those posture decisions are going to be made. So I think it's really important, super timely, and it's really setting the tone for what SecDef Austin and the Biden administration are going to be about. It's clearly showing that some of the almost frenetic back and forth that we had on posture, particularly, in places like Syria, as well as in, Germany and Poland under the Trump administration. I think they're trying to demonstrate we're not going to have that kind of back and forth. There's going to be an analytic process in which, posture choices are going to be tied to clear national interests and objectives if they can actually make it work. And I think that's really just trying to set the tone for what it is that they're going to at least be trying to do. It's a question of whether some of the bureaucratic inertia that exists and particularly exists within the combatant commands going to allow that to genuinely happen.
Yeah, it's hard to separate this in the Global Posture Review out from sort of maybe the smoke signals, or at least the very clear direction by omission of where the Biden administration's focus is going to be. I don't think it's any great sort of hot take to say that the core focus of their national security priorities are going to be on rebuilding U.S. alliances, and I think that is particularly in Europe and with NATO, but obviously in the Pacific. And those two sort of blocks of territory neatly line up with a holdover from the Trump administration, but sort of a vintage idea from the Obama administration, which is that the driving focus of U.S. National security planning should be with so-called great power competitors. I call them peer adversaries, and those being China and Russia, and obviously trying to put sort of the post 9/11 Middle East wars, or the quote-unquote forever wars, in the rear view. Do you think that that's sort of all enmeshed together here, or do you think I'm misreading the situation?
No, I think you're spot on. I think that there's the Biden administration has made clear that, great power competition is very much here to stay, and that China in particular is sort of the top tier challenge. And so I think we're going to see a lot of posture changes perhaps taking place in the Indo-Pacific. I think one place to really be watching, because there's going to be some alliance management issues, is going to be South Korea. There was a bit of back and forth about whether, the U.S. footprint in Korea was going to change under the Trump administration. So I think this new administration has a little bit of work to do there. I also think Europe you're spot on that it's really going to be about rebuilding some of those alliances, or at least the strength of those alliances, purposely calling out that the troop withdrawal from Germany was on hold, I think tells you a lot about what we should expect. So in some ways, if we're reading this correctly, we're thinking that the posture in Europe probably isn't going to change much because of some of the ingrained infrastructure, some of the alliance issues, but that there's need to be there's a need to have, perhaps maybe an increased footprint, or at least a different footprint in the Indo-Pacific. Where are all of these forces and perhaps resources going to come from? And the pretty obvious answer is the Middle East.
You alluded to it earlier, is that the ingrained sort of, let's say, bureaucratic pushback from CENTCOM in particular is likely to be fierce coming up in this. And so I do think that we're going to see some, let's say, bureaucratic battles, probably a lot of which burbles beneath the surface and that only real nerds follow. But how do you see this playing out? CENTCOM has been the main focus of U.S. posture since, I guess, September 12th, or even before that, basically. Basically for the last 30 years, it's been CENTCOM. And now we're looking at this, the aircraft carrier, to use a metaphor, is finally turning. And I think it's quite clear that Indo-PACOM is going to be the main focus of U.S., I guess, realignment of its posture.
Yeah, would we say then that the carrier is actually pivoting?
Pivoted to Asia.
Finally, right? About time.
It's 12 years? 13 years since Obama said that. I can't remember.
Don't age ourselves. Come on. I think what we have here is this, idea that U.S. posture in the Middle East can change, right? We've always thought of it as being, impermanent, that it's, reinforcing for, different wars or for various crises that emerged and it was needed. Instead, kind of approaching posture in the CENTCOM area of operations as something that is much more steady state. And what you would want to see in sort of peacetime competition is, kind of what needs to be done and has been a long time in the offing. And I think it's going to take, a fairly heavy hand, as you say, to, enforce that and to make that the case, because there's definitely a lot of ingrained muscle movement to having sort of this, impermanent approach to how U.S. posture decisions in the Middle East are made.
Yeah, and you can see that this is going to be not just a bureaucratic sort of, I don't want to swear on my own podcast. It's going to be a bureaucratic mess to do this, but there's going to be ancillary politics that play out sort of in the op-ed pages of, say, the Wall Street Journal, because you can't separate any potential changes in posture from sort of broader political questions about how, say, the United States deals with Iran, or how the United States deals with Syria and Iraq, and sort of these three literally connecting countries that drives a lot of U.S. decision making about the region. Now, it's going to get messy. I think we should prepare listeners for this.
Yeah, it's definitely going to get messy. And I think the other place where we should expect to hear some pretty vociferous upset is coming from a lot of, regional partners. You can imagine particularly some of the states in the Gulf are going to be a little bit upset if there are any sort of sizable changes to U.S. posture and presence and some of the forces that frankly have been existing on their territory for quite some time. This is part of what they view as the U.S. security commitment and, the defense of their nations. So, if you remember when there was the pivot to Asia under the Obama administration, we had op-eds about how Saudi was going to go it alone, or about how the U.S. was really, it was leaving its true allies and partners in the dust and retrenching from the region. And so I think we should expect to see retreating, retrenching, words. Words are hard. It's a Friday. Expect to see that playing out in a lot of the op-ed pages as well. And also a lot of it behind closed doors. I expect a lot of demarches to be taking place in Middle Eastern capitals.
Yeah, I think we should explain this just a little bit. because it's often sort of misconstrued in sort of the costs to sustain U.S. presence in CENTCOM, but the costs are a bit defrayed in terms of the basing arrangements that we have. And so it's not necessarily a dollars and cents types of things. It's different types of things. It's how persistent, let's say, rotations out to the Middle East or the allocation of finite resources to the Middle East takes away from readiness or increases the cost of maintenance for where these equipment could be used elsewhere in terms of a higher priority region.
Yep. And that is just something that is often missed, and why there needs to be a new approach to how it is that we determine some of these posture choices. It's also worth mentioning that sort of by virtue, bases are sunk costs. And this is true even in the Middle East, where you do have, some host nations, particularly in the Gulf, who are able to defray some of those costs because host nation, pays for some of the infrastructure upkeep, as well as some of the infrastructure enhancements.
So let's look forward a little bit, as we wrap up. How do you think this ultimately goes? I have a vision in my head about how you could make this work. It's a good time, I think, to be in the Navy, but it just seems like we made the joke that we finally finished the pivot 12 or 13 years later, but it now seems that we've pivoted. Is that, both in declaratory statements that are coming out from the Biden administration, in the fact that the Global Posture Review is taking place at this time, and I think the most important thing is that the allocation of defense dollars in the annual defense budgets, it's very clear that this pivot is almost done. Maybe we've pirouetted. Well, pirouette's a full 360, so we'll be back in the Middle East. But you get my point. Is that it's a good time to be focused on East Asia, because I think that that's where the main focus is going to be.
Yep, I think you're entirely right. The one thing that I will note, maybe it's a good time to be in the Navy, but the Navy is having some massive readiness issues. So the more that, the Navy ends up being the way in which we make up for presence that isn't necessarily at fixed bases, it remains to be seen whether, they can actually handle that over the long term, or if it comes at the cost of readiness and some of the maintenance of, carriers and other sizable assets. One thing that we really haven't talked about, and we can always think about ways in which you can make it work to make up for perhaps, a less permanent presence in a variety of different regions. I usually tend to be fairly dismissive of the dynamic force employment concept, in part because I think it's used incorrectly, and it's sort of the name that folks give to any type of deployment that could in some way signal presence, or, can be used to deter, or just a security cooperation mission of any sort. But there's a way in which you could actually use dynamic force employment smartly to purposely try and signal to both adversaries as well as allies and partners about the ability of U.S. forces to be present, and on a very particular timeline, and one that would allow U.S. forces to be able to flow into any type of theater on a timeline that is perhaps necessary in the case of a crisis or conflict. So it's worth thinking about ways in which we can use different concepts like dynamic force employment to make up for some of the gaps in a permanent presence.
Can you just explain that in 30 seconds to the listeners? I know what you're talking about, but I'm not sure that my mother listening to this podcast would know exactly what you're talking about.
Okay, well, Mama Stein, let me tell you. So dynamic force employment is just the terminology that's been used to explain how any type of force could be deployed at a moment's notice without a high degree of preparation, in part to be quote unquote operationally unpredictable, as the 2018 National Defense Strategy laid out, but also to show that U.S. forces can be ready at any given time in order to increase their responsiveness.
And I think one of the ways to sort of bring this full circle is that with that basing architecture in the region, even if you have, like, say, a less number of physical troops in the Middle East, and there are more troops allocated either to the continental United States or places in Europe or out in the Indo-Pacific, is that physical basing infrastructure isn't going to go away. at least it shouldn't go away, and so that these places can become sort of hubs, or they are hubs, for which you could surge forces in a crisis, and you could unpredictably, at irregular intervals, return forces, say for exercises or joint exercises with partner nations, as a mechanism to try and reassure them that the U.S. isn't quote unquote pivoting to Asia. Would you say I accurately summarized your main point?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, the key there is just these bases aren't going away, but the infrastructure needs to be kept up. And that's something that, the United States can hash out in advance with host nations, and can be part of, frankly, some of the access agreements that the United States has that undergirds its global posture.
Yeah, and it really does drive home, and then we'll wrap up here, the tough job the Biden administration has. It's very easy to say, look, leave the Middle East, get these guys out of there. They've been fighting forever wars since, basically when October 2001, really dating ourselves. And send them to Korea, like sort of in the abstract. But the difficult part is in all those political arrangements, that would go into being able to return forces there. And if you interweave that with the overarching sort of priorities of the Biden administration, which I assume will be sort of to recalibrate policy on Iran, how tricky and difficult this is going to get within the next 2 years. This is just the opening sort of foray. We're on the first skip of the rock in the pond, and it's going to be hard. So I'm sure we'll have a lot more podcasts about it.
Absolutely. I do not envy the Biden administration in the slightest right now. They've got a pretty sizable challenge ahead. They're
clearly signaling that the Middle East is not their top priority, but the process of unsticking yourself from this very sticky place is going to be painful and difficult, and many, many words will be written in many, many publications about abandoning allies. With that said, Becca, as always, it's a pleasure. I know you have a meeting to go to, so we'll have to have you back on soon.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Aaron.
My pleasure. And everybody, thank you for listening.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Chain Reaction. Be sure to subscribe to Chain Reaction on iTunes and Spotify, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter at the handle @FPRI. Chain Reaction is a podcast of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank in Philadelphia. For more information about this and other initiatives, be sure to visit www.fpri.org.